The roses arrived at Westwood Memorial Cemetery every week, 3 times a week, for 37 years. 6 red roses in a simple arrangement, ordered from the same florist, delivered to the same grave, paid for by the same man who had loved her when she was alive and couldn't stop loving her after she was gone. Joe DiMaggio never missed a week. Not through remarriage rumors that never materialized because he never remarried. Not through decades of his own life continuing without her. Not through aging and illness and the passage of time that dims most memories and softens most grief. For 37 years, from the day Marilyn Monroe was buried in 1962 until the day Joe DiMaggio died in 1999, those roses kept coming. It was the most expensive, most consistent, most heartbreaking romantic gesture in Hollywood history. And it started with a blind date that neither of them wanted to go on. March 1952. Joe DiMaggio was recently retired from baseball, the greatest player the Yankees had ever had. Uncomfortable with his new civilian life and not interested in dating actresses. He'd been married once before, to an actress, and it had ended badly. When a friend suggested setting him up with Marilyn Monroe, Joe's response was dismissive. "I don't like movie stars. They're all fake." But his friend persisted, and somehow Joe agreed to meet her for dinner. Marilyn, for her part, wasn't particularly interested either. She was dating other men, focused on her career, and not impressed by athletes. "I don't know anything about baseball," she told her friend. "What would we even talk about?" But she agreed to the dinner, probably because saying no required more energy than saying yes. Neither of them expected anything. Both of them walked into that restaurant prepared to be polite for an hour and never see each other again. And then they saw each other. Joe DiMaggio was 47 years old, gray at the temples, reserved and quiet in the way of men who'd grown up during the Depression and learned that talking didn't accomplish much. Marilyn Monroe was 25, platinum blonde and luminous, the rising star that everyone in Hollywood wanted to touch. They should have had nothing in common. But when Joe saw Marilyn walk into that restaurant, something in his careful reserve cracked open. And when Marilyn met Joe's eyes across the table, she saw something she'd been searching for her entire life. A man who looked at her like she was valuable, not because of what she looked like, but because of who she was. The date lasted 5 hours. They talked about everything except baseball and movies. And when Joe drove Marilyn home that night, she knew, and he knew, that something had started that was going to be complicated and painful and impossible to walk away from. The courtship was intense and old-fashioned. Joe sent flowers, roses, always roses. He called her every day. He took her to quiet restaurants where they could talk without being mobbed by photographers. He was jealous from the start, uncomfortable with Marilyn's fame, troubled by the way men looked at her, resentful of the Hollywood machine that packaged and sold her image. But he was also deeply, genuinely in love in a way that terrified him. Joe DiMaggio was not a man who expressed emotions easily. But with Marilyn, he couldn't help it. She brought out something vulnerable in him, something desperate, something that made him want to protect her from a world that he could see was hurting her, even as it made her famous. Marilyn fell in love with Joe's steadiness, his old-world values, his belief that marriage meant forever and family meant everything. She'd grown up without stability, passed between foster homes, never sure where she belonged. Joe represented everything she'd always wanted, a strong man who would take care of her, who would build a home with her, who would give her the family she'd never had. So when Joe proposed in January 1954, Marilyn said yes. They were married at San Francisco City Hall, with reporters swarming outside and flashbulbs popping and the whole world watching. Marilyn wore a dark suit, simple and elegant. Joe wore a blue suit and looked happier than anyone had ever seen him. They kissed for the cameras, and for that moment, it seemed like the fairy tale was real. But the fairy tale lasted exactly 9 months, because loving Marilyn Monroe and being married to Marilyn Monroe turned out to be 2 very different things. The problem was fundamental and unfixable. Joe wanted a wife who would quit Hollywood and stay home. Marilyn wanted a husband who would support her career and understand her need to work. Joe had married her believing she would eventually choose him over fame. Marilyn had married him believing he would eventually accept who she was. Neither of them was willing to change. Neither of them could change, really, because the things dividing them weren't small compromises. They were core beliefs about what love and marriage and life should look like. And so the fight started. Not violent fights, not dramatic Hollywood blow-ups, but quiet, devastating fights where Joe would withdraw into silent disappointment, and Marilyn would cry and beg him to understand. They fought about her career. They fought about her clothes. They fought about publicity and photographers and the fact that everywhere they went, Marilyn was Marilyn Monroe, and Joe was just the guy she was with. For a man who had been the greatest baseball player of his generation, being Mr. Monroe was unbearable. But here's the thing that makes their story so heartbreaking. Even while they were fighting, even while the marriage was falling apart, they loved each other desperately. Joe loved Marilyn with a fierce, possessive intensity that wanted to wrap her up and keep her safe from everyone and everything. Marilyn loved Joe with a grateful, aching need for the stability and protection he represented. The love was real. The love was deep. The love was just fundamentally incompatible with the lives they were actually living. September 1954, the breaking point came during the filming of The 7-Year Itch. There's a famous scene where Marilyn stands over a subway grate and her white dress blows up around her waist. It's one of the most iconic images in Hollywood history. Marilyn laughing, dress flying, every man on the street staring at her. The scene was filmed on a New York street corner at night with thousands of spectators watching. And Joe DiMaggio was in that crowd, watching his wife perform sexy and playful for the cameras while men whistled and shouted crude comments. Every click of the camera shutter felt like a betrayal to him. Every cheer from the crowd felt like a violation. He stood there in the darkness, jaw clenched, watching the woman he loved give herself to the world, while he stood by helpless and furious. That night, back at their hotel, they had the worst fight of their marriage. Neighbors reported hearing shouting. Some reports claim there was violence, though neither Joe nor Marilyn ever confirmed that. What we know for certain is that when morning came, the marriage was effectively over. October 27, 1954. After only 9 months of marriage, Marilyn Monroe filed for divorce. She stood on the steps of their Los Angeles home and told reporters, "I'm sorry, but I have to do this." She looked devastated. Joe stayed inside, refusing to face the cameras, his face a mask of hurt and anger. The official reason was mental cruelty, which was the standard Hollywood excuse. The real reason was that two people who loved each other couldn't find a way to be married without destroying each other. The divorce was finalized quickly. Joe moved back to San Francisco. Marilyn stayed in Los Angeles and threw herself into work. Everyone assumed that was the end of the story. Everyone was wrong, because Joe DiMaggio never stopped loving Marilyn Monroe. Not for one day, not for 1 hour. The divorce didn't end the relationship. It just changed its form. Joe called Marilyn constantly. He sent flowers. He invited her to San Francisco. He made it clear that he was waiting, that he would always be waiting, that if she ever decided Hollywood wasn't worth it, he would be there. And Marilyn, despite moving on to marry Arthur Miller in 1956, despite having affairs with the Kennedy brothers, despite building a life that looked nothing like the one Joe wanted for her, Marilyn kept Joe in her life. She called him when things got bad. She leaned on him when Hollywood broke her heart. She trusted him in ways she trusted almost no one else. Because Joe's love, however possessive and jealous it was also the most reliable constant in Marilyn's chaotic life. He loved her when she was young and famous. He loved her when she got older and Hollywood turned on her. He loved her when she was struggling with addiction and depression. His love didn't depend on her being Marilyn Monroe. It depended on her being the woman he'd fallen for on that first blind date. And that kind of love is rare enough to be worth holding on to, even when you can't live with it. By 1962, Marilyn was in trouble. Her marriage to Arthur Miller had ended. Her last film had been a disaster. She'd been fired from Something's Got to Give. She was struggling with addiction, with depression, with the sense that Hollywood had used her up and thrown her away. And who did she turn to? Joe. In those final months of her life, Joe DiMaggio was back in Marilyn's world, talking to her regularly, trying to help her get clean, making plans for them to maybe, possibly, try again. He took her to spring training in Florida. He talked about them getting remarried. He believed, and Marilyn seemed to believe too, that maybe this time they could make it work. Maybe now that Hollywood had hurt her enough, she'd be ready to choose the quiet life with him. Maybe they'd get their second chance. August 5, 1962, Joe DiMaggio got the phone call that Marilyn Monroe was dead. He was in San Francisco. He got on the first flight to Los Angeles. And when he arrived at the funeral home where Marilyn's body had been taken, Joe DiMaggio took control. He banned everyone from Hollywood. No studio executives, no famous co-stars, no directors or producers or anyone who had made money off Marilyn's fame and pain. Joe invited only a handful of people, Marilyn's closest friends, her acting coach, a few people who had actually cared about her as a person rather than a commodity. And then Joe organized a funeral that was quiet and dignified and completely unlike the Hollywood spectacle everyone expected. He chose her coffin, her dress, the flowers. He made sure everything was done with respect and love. And at the funeral, standing by her casket, Joe DiMaggio reportedly said to Marilyn's body, "I told you we should have gotten married again. I told you you'd be better off with me." That could have been the end of the story. A tragic love, a man saying goodbye to the woman he couldn't save. But for Joe DiMaggio, it was just the beginning of a very long commitment. After the funeral, Joe made arrangements with a florist. 6 red roses, 3 times a week, delivered to Marilyn's grave at Westwood Memorial Cemetery. The roses would continue for exactly 20 years, Joe specified in the original order. That's what he committed to. 20 years of roses for the woman he'd loved and lost. But when 20 years passed in 1982, Joe didn't stop. He renewed the order, and again in 1992, and again in 1999. For 37 years, those roses kept coming. 6 red roses, 3 times a week, every single week. The florist estimated that Joe DiMaggio spent over $1 million on those roses over the decades. That's $1 million spent talking to a ghost, maintaining a ritual, keeping alive a love that death should have ended but somehow didn't. And it wasn't just the roses. Joe DiMaggio never remarried. He dated occasionally in the early years, after Marilyn's death, but nothing serious ever developed. Friends would ask him why he didn't settle down with someone else, why he didn't try to build a new life. Joe's answer was always some variation of, "I had my love. She's gone. There won't be another one." He spent his later years living quietly, in San Francisco, working as a coach and commentator, attending baseball games. And every time anyone asked him about Marilyn Monroe, his face would soften and he'd say something about how she was special, how nobody understood her, how much he missed her. He protected her memory fiercely, refusing to participate in tell-all books or exploitation documentaries. When people spread rumors about her, Joe would get angry. When Hollywood tried to make money off her image, Joe would publicly condemn it. He spent the last 37 years of his life being the guardian of Marilyn Monroe's dignity, a role he'd wanted when she was alive but couldn't quite manage because loving her meant accepting her fame, and Joe never could do that. But loving her memory, that he could do. That he did beautifully. In interviews, Joe would sometimes talk about the mistakes he made. "I was too jealous," he said once. "I should have let her be who she was. I should have supported her career instead of resenting it. I loved her, but I didn't know how to love her the right way." That kind of self-awareness, coming decades after the marriage ended, is both heartbreaking and admirable. Joe DiMaggio spent the last half of his life knowing that he'd had the love of his life and lost her partly because of his own inability to adapt. That's a heavy burden to carry. But he carried it by loving her memory with the devotion he hadn't quite managed when she was alive. There's a famous photograph from 1993, 31 years after Marilyn's death. Jo DiMaggio is at her grave on what would have been her 67th birthday. He's 89 years old, gray and stooped, wearing a dark suit. He's standing by her marker, where those roses he's been sending for 3 decades are arranged in fresh vases. And the look on his face? It's grief, yes, but it's also something else. It's the look of a man who has spent 3 decades in conversation with someone who isn't there, who has maintained a relationship with memory and loss, and a love that refused to die even when one half of it did. Looking at that photograph, you understand that for Jo DiMaggio, Marilyn never really left. She was always there, always present, always the woman he loved and lost and couldn't let go. March 8, 1999. Jo DiMaggio died at age 84 from lung cancer and other complications. In his final days, he was surrounded by family and friends. And according to those who were there, one of the last things he said was, "I'll finally get to see Marilyn again." After 37 years of sending roses to a grave, after 37 years of holding on to a love that existed more in memory than in reality, Jo DiMaggio died believing he was going to be reunited with the woman who had been the love of his life. Whether you believe in that kind of afterlife or not, there's something deeply moving about a man spending the last 4 decades of his life faithful to a ghost, and then dying with the hope that the ghost was waiting for him. When Jo died, the roses stopped. The arrangement he'd maintained for 37 years finally ended, but his family maintained the tradition for a while after his death, and even now, fans and romantics continue to leave roses at Marilyn's grave, inspired by Jo's legendary devotion. The story has become mythic. The baseball hero and the movie star, married for 9 months, divorced but never not in love, separated by death but not by devotion. It's the kind of love story that Hollywood would never make because it's too bittersweet, too complicated, too honest about how love can be real and deep and still not enough to overcome fundamental incompatibilities. So, what's the moral of this story? Is it that true love conquers all? Not really. Jo and Marilyn's love didn't conquer anything when she was alive. Is it that you should never give up on love? Maybe. But the reality is that they gave up on the marriage because staying married was destroying both of them. Is it that grand romantic gestures are meaningful? Perhaps, but you have to wonder if Marilyn would have traded 37 years of posthumous roses for 1 year of Jo accepting her career when she was alive. The truth is more complicated and more real than any simple moral. Jo DiMaggio loved Marilyn Monroe as much as one person can love another, but that love, during her lifetime, was tangled up with jealousy and possessiveness and his inability to accept her independence. After her death, that love became pure, because loving a memory doesn't require compromise or acceptance of complexity. You can love a ghost exactly as you want to love them. But despite the complications, despite the ways their relationship failed when it mattered most, there's still something deeply moving about Jo DiMaggio's devotion. For 37 years, he kept faith with a woman who was gone. For 37 years, he sent roses that nobody but cemetery workers would see. For 37 years, he refused to let go, refused to move on, refused to accept that love ends when life does. That kind of constancy is rare. That kind of devotion is extraordinary. Even if it's also a little bit tragic, even if it's also partly about Jo's own inability to move forward, it's still one of the most romantic gestures in modern history. Because at the end of the day, Jo DiMaggio looked at the world and said, "I loved her. I still love her. I will always love her. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The roses that Jo sent for 37 years weren't really for Marilyn. She was gone. She couldn't see them, couldn't smell them, couldn't appreciate the gesture. The roses were for Jo himself, a way of maintaining connection, a ritual that gave shape to grief, a promise kept to himself about who he was going to be in the aftermath of losing her. And in that sense, the roses were one of the most honest expressions of love imaginable. I love you. You're gone. I'm going to love you anyway. Not because it changes anything, not because it brings you back, but because this is who I am. This is what my love looks like. It looks like roses, 3 times a week, for the rest of my life. When people visit Westwood Memorial Cemetery today and stop at Marilyn Monroe's grave, and thousands do every year, many of them leave flowers. Roses, usually. Red roses in tribute to Joe. The grave is never without flowers because the love story between Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe has become bigger than either of them, has become a symbol of devotion that survives death and devotion that acknowledges failure but persists anyway. It's messy and complicated and so deeply human. They couldn't make it work when she was alive. But after she was gone, Joe spent 37 years proving that his love was real, even if his ability to love her correctly during her lifetime was flawed. There are other details about Joe's devotion that make the story even more poignant. After Marilyn's death, Joe stayed in touch with Marilyn's half-sister, Bernice Miracle, sending her Christmas cards every year and checking in to make sure she was okay. He maintained relationships with the few people who had genuinely cared about Marilyn, creating a kind of informal family of her memory. When the Kennedys tried to distance themselves from Marilyn after her death, when Hollywood gossip columnists spread cruel rumors, Joe was there defending her reputation, reminding people that she'd been a real person who deserved respect. He became the keeper of the true story, the person who remembered Marilyn as she actually was rather than as the myth had made her. And here's something that will break your heart. Joe kept a photograph of Marilyn on his bedside table for 37 years. Not a publicity shot, not a glamorous Hollywood portrait, but a candid photo from their honeymoon in Japan. In the photo, Marilyn is laughing at something Joe said, her head thrown back, looking genuinely happy. That's the Marilyn Joe wanted to remember. Not the tortured actress, not the symbol, but the woman he'd made laugh on their honeymoon before everything went wrong. Every morning for 37 years, that photograph was the first thing Joe saw when he woke up. And every night for 37 years, it was the last thing he saw before he went to sleep. Think about that level of devotion. Think about waking up every day for nearly 4 decades and choosing to start your morning looking at the face of the woman you lost. Joe's son from his first marriage once said in an interview that living with his father's devotion to Marilyn was complicated. On one hand, he admired his father's loyalty. On the other hand, it was clear that part of Joe had died with Marilyn and never came back. He was a good father, his son said, but there was always this sadness in him, this sense that the best part of his life was over, and he was just going through the motions of everything that came after. That's the cost of that kind of love. It's beautiful and devoted, but it's also a kind of self-imposed exile from the possibility of new joy. Joe chose Marilyn's memory over any chance of future happiness with someone else. You can call that romantic, or you can call that tragic, and both would be accurate. There were moments over the years when Joe came close to moving on. In the 1970s, he dated a woman named Linda for several months. She was kind and patient, and by all accounts, she cared deeply for Joe. Friends thought maybe this was finally it. Maybe Joe was ready to build something new. But then came Marilyn's birthday, and Joe disappeared for the day to visit her grave. And when he came back, Linda could see that wherever Joe had been emotionally, it wasn't with her. The relationship ended shortly after. Linda later told a reporter, "I understood. How do you compete with a ghost? How do you compete with a love that never got the chance to fail or become ordinary? I couldn't. Nobody could." And she was right. The Marilyn in Joe's memory would always be 25 and beautiful, and the woman he didn't know how to love correctly. Real women, with real complications and real aging and real demands, couldn't compete with that perfect memory. But wait until you hear about what happened when they tried to make a movie about Marilyn in the 1980s. Joe was approached by producers wanting his cooperation on a Marilyn biopic. They offered him money, consulting fees, whatever he wanted. Joe's response was immediate and absolute. No. He wouldn't participate. He wouldn't help. He didn't want Hollywood turning Marilyn's pain into entertainment. They used her when she was alive, he said. They're not going to use her now that she's dead. He became very protective about how Marilyn was portrayed in media, speaking out against sensationalized books and exploitation films. For Joe, loving Marilyn's memory meant protecting it from the same industry that had chewed her up and spit her out during her lifetime. It was a 37-year campaign to give her in death the respect and protection he hadn't been able to give her in life. The roses became legendary over the years. Reporters would ask Joe about them, and his answers were always brief. She liked roses. I send them. He never wanted to make a big deal out of it, never wanted to use his devotion as a way to get attention or sympathy. The gesture was private, between him and a gravestone, between him and his memory of her. But of course, in a city like Los Angeles, in a culture obsessed with Hollywood romance, the story got out. And it became part of the Marilyn Monroe legend, the baseball player who couldn't stop loving her, who sent roses for decades, who proved that at least one man had loved her for real. In some ways, Joe's devotion redeemed all the men who had used her, all the powerful people who had exploited her. It proved that someone had seen her value, someone had wanted to protect her, someone had loved her truly, even if he'd loved her badly. When Marilyn's belongings were auctioned off decades after her death, Joe attended the auction. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Joe's 37 years of roses were romantic or tragic? Should he have moved on and built a new life? If you could only have 9 months with your soulmate, would you take it knowing how much it would hurt later? What's the most devoted thing you've ever done for love? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this love story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more stories about Hollywood's greatest romances, the loves that survived everything, and the devotion that transcends death. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.